All right, welcome back again to another episode of the Contrarians. This is going to be one of our regular format shows where we have a guest, or it's me, or it's Marco, or somebody. This time we have Ralph Chapman, a good buddy of mine. There we go, Ralph. How you doing? You ready to do this? You ready to do some Peter Gabriel?
Yeah, I'm ready to talk about Peter Gabriel, PG.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so yeah, the idea with one of our regular shows is that somebody has a pretty contrarian view for a favorite album by a band, and we are going to be talking about Peter Gabriel this time. Ralph is a good buddy of mine. We worked together on the Rush movie and the ZZ Top movie and Metal Evolution and all that at Banger Films. He's also been part of a couple of my books. He was on my esteemed panel for the Rush album by album and the Pink Floyd album by album books. Right. And you know, he's a super wise music swami and definitely a prog expert. He's a Peter Gabriel. I don't want to put you on the spot, but he knows his Peter Gabriel, but even more so, he knows his Phil Collins. And I'm also going to have him back for we're also going to do the Pink Floyd one together. Pretty sure in the next couple of weeks, because he's got some great stuff to say about his favorite Pink Floyd album. But yeah, just to start with, just a quick history of Peter Gabriel. So Peter Gabriel, of course, he was on 6 Genesis albums, and then he went solo. Genesis lost Steve Hackett and Peter Gabriel and went on to great fame. But he went solo, and he put out a series of self-titled albums. We've got Car or Rain or whatever you want to call it, but it's just called Peter Gabriel. So that came out February 25th, 77. It actually went gold in the States, which is quite bizarre, but it had a bit of a hit on it, Salisbury Hill. But anyway, so that was his first album. Then he had another one, which people call Scratch. So there you go. That's the second album. And then the third album was called Face Melt or Melt. My funny story about this album is I went and did a memorabilia buy off of Backstage Auctions a little while ago. Well, quite a while ago. But I have a 4-panel poster of this, which I think each panel is 32 square feet. So it's something like 128. I've got 128 square foot poster of that, which is nuts. It's all folded up into. I don't know where I'm going to put that thing, but. And then, just a couple singles that come from that. I don't remember. And then he had the Security album, but also a self-titled. And this was a pretty big album for him as well. Oddly enough, in Canada, Peter Gabriel's done pretty good. The second album, Scratch, went platinum in Canada. So that was 78. Melt was May 23rd, 80. And that went double platinum in Canada, which is pretty bizarre. Security went gold in the States. And platinum in Canada. There's my German copy of that. The whole thing in German. There's Shock the Monkey. Then he had a big live album. One of my favorite concert experiences was seeing Peter Gabriel in the very first concert in BC Place Stadium in Vancouver. So it was the Tubes, then Peter Gabriel, then David Bowie on Let's Dance. And then he had his huge album. Then he had with Kate Bush on there, and Don't Give Up. That went 5 times platinum in the States. That was May 19th, 1986. Then we've got some CDs here. Then things spread out even more. So he's 4 years between albums. Then there's my CD of that. So yeah, we got plays live in between. But then we go all the way up to 1992 for Us, which went platinum. And then, there's another live album in there somewhere. And then we've got Up another 10 years later. Into September 24th, 2002. And that's basically it. He's got the Scratch My Back or whatever it's called with covers with an orchestra. And he's got the New Blood thing, which is orchestral re-recordings of his own songs. But yeah, we haven't seen a actual Peter Gabriel album of new stuff for 20 years now. So he just basically got to be one of these guys that's the album started spreading out. And, he was doing well. The concerts were selling well. But yeah, very fearlessly creative kind of guy. a lot of variations in the records throughout the years. But yeah, so that's your brief history. I don't know, Ralph, anything important that I left out? Mention a few things and then tell us what your favorite Gabriel album is.
Well, just a bit that he left out. I mean, the last 20 years, he hasn't been totally silent. He did a lot of odd job soundtrack work, singles, Wall-E and things like that. And I'm sure, and different compilations, OVO and I think it's called The Big Blue Ball, and, you know, working a lot with real world artists. So he just hasn't done a proper album per se, I guess you're right. And since Up, which is now 20 years ago, as I think you mentioned, which is tragic, really. Apparently he's been working on a follow-up for the last 2 or 3 years, has 30 or 40 songs, but whether it will be in this lifetime or in some sort of parallel universe, by the time we see that, I have no idea.
Yeah. But Passion was a big album for him too, right? That was double album. Yeah.
Passion, and one of the things that I was quite fond of that came out right after or right before Plays Live was called Birdie, which was a soundtrack.
Right. Yeah.
Which drew on the music of the third and the fourth record, sort of repurposed them for this soundtrack for Birdie, which was, I think, a Nick Cage film. And Matthew Modine. Never saw it because it seemed too depressing, but certainly bought the album. And first time I saw Gabriel was at the C&E Bandshell on the Playtime tour. It was called Playtime 88. And it was an interesting experience because I was stuck way at the back, but it was a very, I don't want to go too far on a tangent, but it was a very different experience than listening to the records. It was very performative. It was a lot of audience participation, a lot of those things where when I listen to Peter Gabriel, it's a very insular experience, a very ruminative experience. And Peter Gabriel 2 is I think no exception. An album so close and dear to my heart since I was 17 years of age.
Okay.
And, you know, the show's called The Contrarians, and you know me, Martin. I think my father taught me well. I'm contrarian by nature. But, you know, when you're a teenager and you're just starting to discover these new bands, and this happened many times to me in high school, you start attracting other people who want to coach you or guide you when they find out that you're getting into an artist. And, you know, it happened with me with Led Zeppelin. I had Zeppelin fans of high school saying, catalog's great except Led Zeppelin 3. Don't bother with that one. And Peter Gabriel was no exception. I learned very early on as the word got out back in those crazy early 80s that I was into Peter Gabriel. People would say it's all, you know, at that point, there were 4 albums out, I think, at that point, and they all said, get the first, the third, and the fourth. Awesome. But there was this strange mystery about the second record, which, of course, piqued my interest. I mean, I was going to buy the whole catalog anyway because I had been introduced to the Genesis family through Abacab, and I was mental about creating a huge catalog for myself of everything they did, including all the solo work and all the rest of it. So that was kind of my interest in getting Peter Gabriel 2 was in part due to the fact that everyone seemed to dismiss it as something that was not Peter at his finest. So anyway, from there, once I bought it and put it on, it was instantly appealing to me. And I think part of it was the first track is called On the Air, and it starts with these kind of bubbling synthesizers, and then pow, it hits you in the same way as Back in New York City did for me. The Genesis track on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, side 2, track 1. Very powerful, just dragged me right in. And again, going back to that era, 82, where I'd already heard Security and I'd already heard the third album. So his embracing of, let's call it world music or rhythm-based music, rhythm-based pop music, he was already seen as kind of a humanitarian. You know, the song Biko was the first time I'd heard about apartheid in South Africa, but this album, the second album, why I loved it so much and continue to love it, it was Peter Gabriel finding his voice, searching for something, being a progressive artist, which is why I love Genesis and why I love Gabriel. So, and when you say, or when someone says, oh, they're searching for their sound, they hadn't found it yet, it's often perceived as this pejorative, a negative. But to me, that's the most exciting time to listen to an artist, when he or she is searching for that sound, experimenting, exploring. And Peter Gabriel was, to me, one of the greatest explorers in rock music, and hopefully still is. But I was thinking about it, and Peter wasn't just looking for a sound, of a vocal sound or a songwriting style, or he wasn't exploring just that. He was exploring different record labels. He was exploring different producers. The only thing he wasn't exploring was the title of his records, which I always thought was hilarious. Even the way he wore his hair, he was changing it. On the tour for the second Peter Gabriel album, he had shaved his head. And though the cover has him in full bangs, almost Beatlesque, he was just a guy churning and looking and searching and musing and experimenting. And that is what electrified me. But of course, looking back on it, people have often talked about this record as influenced by punk, or obviously Robert Fripp produced it. So there was a kind of a New York punk vibe. And I can't really speak to that, because my access, or my entrance into that record is, again, through the prism of Genesis. So I wasn't even thinking about punk and all that stuff. So anyway, the record, as I mentioned on the air, but the most telling thing, and I know, Martin, you can respond to this idea, but I would classify Peter Gabriel's Scratch as the only rock album that Peter did. Like out and out electric rock. If you think about the first record with Bob Ezrin, first of all, Bob Ezrin's signature is all over that record. It's very, at times, very bombastic, very dynamic, he's got the LSO on it. And rarely did Bob Ezrin, as his career moved on, if you think about Kiss Destroyer, or you think about The Wall, his albums tended to be sonically huge, bombastic, dramatic. Not that Scratch isn't that, but it achieves those things in a different, much smaller way, through electric guitars and through all sorts of different instruments that were unique to Peter Gabriel at that point. And he never really revisited steel guitars and mandolins. And though the album was dense, you listened to it and it felt like a stripped down rock record. And also, and I'll get into this a bit later, which is to do with the production, the way it was mixed. The guitars were way up front. The drums were thundering. The bass was deep and defined. It felt to me like almost like Peter Gabriel's Presence album, if I can refer to Led Zeppelin, which may seem preposterous, but it rocked. Yeah. Not that it didn't have a lot of variety, but when it rocked, it was authentic and real. It wasn't pastiche. It wasn't a piss take. It was a rock record, and he had the pipes, I think, to pull that off as well. You got to hear Peter sing at near the top of his range a lot. Again, that might have been punk. That might have been Peter Hamill, his buddy in Van der Graaf Generator's influence. I don't know. I think it was more about the fact that this album lyrically is a collection of stories about the little guy, Springsteen-esque in the sense that it's just about 10 little vignettes of people just trying to make their way through life, trying to deal with grief and trauma and aging and all these very, very large to them, but very small to the rest of us. When I think about that, I think of what he was in Genesis, very, very theatrical. And in my mind, Peter always treated a song like an actor would treat a part. He inhabited the character of the song, which gave him an impressive amount of emotional range in any given song, because he's not just singing it to sing it well or in pitch, but he's actually in a song like Indigo, which is seems to be about someone who is dealing with his own mortality and the regrets of his life, and just the exhaustion of getting old. You'd never know that the guy singing that was a 27-year-old guy. He sounds very much like someone in his 60s. And I often wonder why people haven't covered Indigo, but that's a song I'll get to as well. Other characters, you got the delusional sort of wannabe hitman in Animal Magic. You've got the paperback philosopher guy in DIY, and nobody happy with what he got. All these kinds of, again, different personas that he effortlessly puts into this record. Not that Peter didn't do that in his other records, but this one was, like I said, very specific to, again, I call it Springsteen-esque. I think songs like Racing in the Street or Johnny 99, or these very simple stories about people who just are trying to get through life, as opposed to these larger than life explorations that Peter would do. And so this is Peter before he was the guy, like I mentioned previously with Biko, the guy pre-political, pre-WOMAD, pre-amnesty, pre-asylums and mental health issues, arguably. So there was a different type of subject matter he was exploring. And for someone like myself, who's drawn to that kind of thing, that stuff intrigues you when you're younger, when you're a teenager. You can't really identify with it, but it's interesting. Those struggles you have your own struggles when you're a teenager. But when you fast forward through your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, why this album means so much to me is each of those stories has stayed relevant to me, and in some ways even more relevant. I can listen to a song like Biko or Don't Give Up, which is kind of the Depression Dust Bowl kind of thing, and marvel at what he was doing, and have an enormous amount of respect for the craft that went into those songs and the audacity in terms of Biko, one could say. But I don't relate to it like I do these simple tales on the second record. And when you listen to that record, again, with something like a Biko from the third album, it starts off with September 77, and Biko is being interrogated. Again, Don't Give Up, it's this Depression era. But in the second record, you get the sense that these characters are not inhabiting these prisons, these external prisons. They're inhabiting internal prisons, if you know what I mean. You feel these characters are inhabiting basements or little dank apartments or suburban bungalows. They're forgotten. They're not larger than life. And it reminds me of that moment in DIY where he says, you got to keep it small. Again, these are all small stories. And I love that. And the love songs that are on there, they don't resolve. They're songs more of regret and yearning and loneliness. And again, the older you get, if you allow yourself, the more you can plug into those feelings because they are universal. They're shorn of any kind of politics. They're just about the heart. So from a lyric point of view, Peter never explored these issues again, certainly as a whole album. And then behind that is the production and the music. Before I leave it to talk about that, though, I don't know if we can do this on the Contrarians, but I just want to read a lyric from Indigo, which to me is so poignant. When it ends, again, I'll see my friends. They'll give me a lift. I've been running adrift so easy. Shifting the gear, I got nothing to fear from the showdown. I'll go down quiet, and kids downstairs making a hell of a din. I'm all alone, getting a quote for the wages of sin, which is one of the most purest, most heart-wrenching lyrics I think I've ever come across, especially when you get into middle age. Anyway, and Indigo itself, again, I think personally that's probably his greatest achievement in terms of the combination of music and lyric and performance and arrangement. It's just an extraordinary piece of work. It's a standard to me, long lost. And anyway, Robert Fripp's production, it's such a contrast, as I mentioned earlier, from Bob Ezrin, but also Steve Lillywhite and David Lord and Daniel Lanois later was so. The second album is such an analog record with real drums and acoustic guitars. Like when you think about acoustic guitars, other than the first record, Salisbury Hill, say, which is very Spector-esque mass of acoustic guitars. Everything sounds, again, huge. With this, it's just one or two, like on Mother of Violence, there's, I think, only a single acoustic guitar track on there. There's acoustic guitars on DIY, but again, just part of the arrangement with the rest of the instruments as opposed to being prominent. It's just part of the, just another, I'm trying to think of the right painting analogy, but it's just one of the things that Robert called on. And it's easy to say that this album sounds this way because it's Robert Fripp, but I always go back to the credit, which says produced by Robert Fripp for Peter Gabriel. So to me, it's very much a collaborative effort, and Robert wouldn't have been able to do anything that Peter wasn't behind. It's funny too, when you listen to the Steve Lillywhite record, Melt, as you called it, the third record, it really is a product of its time. It's on the dawn of the 80s, and you've got the gated drums, and you've got Dave Rhodes synthesized guitars, and you've got all sorts of, in many ways, that third record reminds me of Sgt. Pepper in the sense that the whole raison d'etre in many ways for Sgt. Pepper was coming from McCartney and Lennon, I suppose, which is, how do we, on this album, let's have a guitar not sound like a guitar. Let's treat a piano. Let's change our vocals. And I feel that way with the third Peter Gabriel, which just makes it an extraordinary piece of work. But it is not the sound of just a guys laying down bed tracks and jamming, and that's what this second record is. Well, the fourth record is David Lord, is like, it's a Fairlight extravaganza, which again, part of that, how do we make an instrument not sound like an instrument? But with this second record, it's just clear, and it's although some might say it's not sophisticated, I think it is sophisticated. The drum sounds are extraordinarily rich. The guitar sounds, the acoustic guitar, the mandolin, it's crisp and it's beautiful sounding achievement to me in production. And I guess too, when I think about it, Fripp's production, because it's, and this is kind of going to be ethereal here, but I was thinking about this last night because I said earlier, lyrically, the stories are little stories, little anecdotal stories about people, but those people are undergoing big things, traumatic things. And I found the production is like that. It's modest, and it's you can hear everything in the stereo picture. It's not a hugely extravagant sounding production, yet at the same time, somehow it sounds big and cinematic. Think about a song like White Shadow or Home Sweet Home, where the stories themselves are fairly compact, but the production sounds both big and small. So it's very hard to define, but it's magical how he pulls that off, how Fripp and Gabriel managed to create a soundtrack to these stories that are both big and small, like the lyrics. And one of the things I want to mention too is the steel guitar. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier. The great thing about the steel guitar, which is really known in country music, but I found it to be just such a great choice when you're telling stories, again, about regular people, because that's what country music is built on. Simple stories about deception and about loss and about love, and steel guitar is the staple of that genre, and it probably still is, but certainly in its classic era. So there's something about a steel guitar that invokes emotional honesty and authenticity. And the fact that Robert and Peter used that, I thought was an extraordinary choice. I also love this record, adore this record, because it's the first record with Jerry Marotta, who to me is one of the great under-recognized players. And I think Jerry came on board on the tour for the first record. But the thing about Jerry is he's a songwriter's drummer. He was the perfect drummer for Peter at that moment. And it made sense that he continued right up until maybe the pre-production of So. I think they parted ways. But other than maybe Ringo, I've never heard a drummer who and Phil Collins, I suppose, who instinctively can understand what is needed, when to be busy, when to be obtrusive, when to be unobtrusive, when to be lyrical, when to punch, when to be jagged, when to be powerful. I think about White Shadow, which is this powerful, anthemic piece of work versus, say, what's the song? A Wonderful Day in a One-Way World, which has this herky-jerky, jagged, fragmented rhythm that perfectly suits the mindset of the character in that song. And again, aided by this drum production where you can hear every single tom and snare and the subtlety, because Peter would abandon cymbals for the next two records after this, for the most part, completely on the third album. But on this, he's given full range of his kit, and Peter has found someone who, like I said, instinctively knows how to create rhythms for these little stories. And the other thing to that is, Peter Gabriel for those first two records, but really through the second record, it was rhythm supporting melody. After the second record, it became melody chasing rhythm. It became very much more involved in creating songs around rhythms. And that was wonderful, remains wonderful, but I felt something was lost in terms of him being a supreme melodicist and really, Peter, really demonstrating his command of melody. And the other thing is Tony Levin, who, because he's very much buried on, in my mind, the way the mix went with Bob Ezrin's first production, the first Peter Gabriel record, he's not nearly as defined, but on the second record, on tracks like Exposure or the double bass on Indigo, but really listen to Exposure. It's a tour de force bass performance. So it was the most exciting. The second album had the most exciting performance by that rhythm section of Murata and Levin that I've ever heard and since. Because it wasn't buried in murk. It was, again, a rock record. It's like listening to John Paul Jones and John Bonham. You could hear it and be driven by it and moved by it and be swayed and all those things that make a rock record a great record, that you want to sit down and just listen, but you also want to move. So that for me is the highlights of why I think Peter Gabriel's second record is so fabulous. I love the artwork. I love and one of the things I loved about it is on the back cover, you have this image. I have my German copy of it. This great image of what appears to be this isolated, perhaps homeless man with the snow and the ice. Just desolation, that says. But if you open it up, it has these great little cartoony images of instruments and people smiling, and Larry Fast smiling, and I think there's Peter grinning. And it, to me, even when I was 17, completely absorbing this record, I thought, isn't that interesting that there's nothing pretentious about this record. And he undercuts the gloominess of this with the levity and the lightness of these photos, of this inner artwork. And that's partially why I think this record works so well as well, is there's air to it. It's not just all depression. It's not just all loss and hopelessness. Again, it's just separate stories. Some have redemption, some don't. Some have anger. Some are just like funny yob type characters. It is just truly a journey of a specific set of humanity that I related to. And the last thing I want to say about Gabriel and on that subject is, one of the things I loved about that second record is no matter what he was singing about, you were locking into the story. You weren't identifying with Gabriel himself. You were identifying with his characters, which to me was the joy of that. I wasn't scanning that record. I mean, face value, Phil Collins' first album is an album I adore and think is an extraordinary piece of work, but it's about him. And you have to get into a mindset that you're listening to basically diary entries of someone. With Gabriel, he achieves this magical thing of moving you, of just putting you in an emotional state. But it's not about listening to someone, an artist, suffer. It's a great storyteller. It's like 11, I think there's 11 songs. I may have said 10 earlier. Yeah, 11 little novels. And, in retrospect, when you think about this record and how it's been treated, he brought out 16 Golden Greats, which was his first greatest hits compilation, completely ignored the record. Then he put out a double CD called Hits, I think DIY was the only track. Warner put out something called Revisited, which was this ignominious combination of the first two records to try and repackage and resell it. So it's not a record that has been revered or given the respect I think it deserves at all, for many reasons. I think when Peter went down the road of being this, again, Amnesty, this humanitarian, and a world music aficionado, and I think this record didn't have the cachet of being his first record after he left Genesis. It just kind of slipped through the cracks. And I was pleased when he did I think it was called the Freshen Up tour back in 2007 or so. he did do Mother of Violence, and he did On the Air, and he did DIY, and I was pleased that he had at least attempted to revisit some of this material of this unbelievably extraordinary and beautiful and moving record. So that's my long treatise.
Very cool. Wow. Yeah. No, that was great. That was really cool. I mean, I just have a few stats on, in terms of it truly being a contrarian choice, and you've made the case. I mean, it's interesting hearing about the greatest hit stuff as well. But just looking at a few polls out there. I mean, classic rock history had, oddly enough, it had Passion as the greatest Peter Gabriel album, and then Melt, and then So. And it's interesting when you think of my favorites would probably be Melt and Security, but in a certain way, I kind of feel like that's taking the easy way out, because you're going for the records with all the flash and the bells and whistles and the innovation, and it's a little bit like. It's a little bit like when I'm being kind of brutal against Pink Floyd The Wall and saying, well, it's the one with the cheap laughs compared to the other records, right?
Right.
So like, Peter Gabriel 2 almost feels like the deeper, smarter, more mature choice, like an Animals versus a Wall, and Wall kind of lines up maybe a little bit more with Melt and Security, where he really has found his sound. But then after that, he goes not back to the rock and roll of 2, but he brings in all the pop elements, and really So and Us and Up are kind of a set to me, and Security and Melt are of a set to me, and the first one and the second one are of a set to me a little bit. So yeah, I don't know. Ultimate Classic Rock had Ultimate Classic Rock did something kind of neat where they mixed it in the rankings with the Phil catalog, and they had So, and then they had Face Value, and then they had Melt, and then they had But Seriously and Us and Security, and again going all the way down. Scratch was way kind of at the bottom of that. What they said about Scratch was Gabriel's second solo release showed that he hadn't gotten any better about reining in his astonishingly varied creative impulses. So there you go about the looking for a sound sort of thing. And certainly that was a really cool insight, that you explained there, that this excitement of an artist looking for a sound still. And that's what he's doing on those first 2 albums. But then he finds a sound, but then Security is quite a refinement of the sound on Melt as well. So he's moving rapidly all the time, granted, as he goes along here. But it says he brought in producer Robert Fripp, however, and the King Crimson Mastermind gave Scratch a crisp sonic feel that tends to unify even its wildest musical side trips. So there you get a sense of what you were saying about the production being important and being a big part of putting all these stories together. The themes are all hard surfaces, leaving no one surprised that this album yielded no hit songs. Instead, Scratch feels more introverted, even less accessible. Well, here they're kind of not agreeing with what you're saying here, but I think you made the point a little better. I mean, introverted is not really the right way to discuss this. I liked your comparison between Phil and Pete on that, but that's why it invites further scrutiny. Same with Gabriel. He was still in search of an identity, but he was getting closer. Return of Rock had So as the greatest album, Melt next, Security, then Debut, then Us, then Passion, then Up, then Scratch. And they say the opening On the Air is superb rocker. Let's see. Gavin song DIY is next, was Gabriel's homage to the punk ethos and punk rock scene. Again, I agree with you. Like, there's no real punk rock to this, but there is a little bit of a of that same thing Bowie did with the crossing over into kind of a New York vibe for a bit there. Just that sense of community that you see there. Stereo Gum had So again. I mean, So is so far ahead, I guess, in all of these superficial polls, because really, I mean, it had such great hits. It was also critically acclaimed, which is a great 1-2 punch. And it was a 5 times platinum album. Like, this is a catalog where one record is so far ahead of all the other records. There are catalogs like that out in the world. But they said with the genre-hopping quirkiness of Carr, Gabriel proved his artistic worth outside of Genesis, but that eclecticism oft felt like restlessness restless muscle flexing as if he were simply trying out every whimsical impulse just to see what stuck. His sophomore effort is just as bizarre, venturing from the elastic 5/4 prog of DIY to the tender piano balladry of Mother of Violence to the abstract funkiness of A Wonderful Day in a One-Way World. But this album feels cohesive in a way Carr didn't. The icy, introverted production, interesting way of putting it, gives the album a warped sonic glue. Gabriel never made another album like this one. Very true. His vocals sounded both sedated and scrappy, a far cry from the gravelly perfectionism he'd display on subsequent albums. It's a difficult album in every sense of the word, but also a worthy investment. Just to finish up, Sea of Tranquility voted Melt the greatest. Then Carr, then Scratch, then So, Security, Us, Up. And then finally, just a little bit of set list stats. The most played Peter Gabriel songs of all time have been Salisbury Hill, Biko, and In Your Eyes. And from this, On the Air came in like 13th. And then you start going way down the list to DIY, White Shadow, way down at number 86, A Wonderful Day in a One-Way World. Yeah. So yeah, it is a very contrarian choice. I mean, it just seems out there, like you say. I mean, it kind of confirms that it's kind of the forgotten album, but you've got great reasons for liking this. So
I just want to say, listening to you talk about those reviews, and Peter Gabriel has never, in my mind, gotten his due as a lyricist. Or if he does, it's in the context of Genesis, these sort of fantastical stories. Because every one of those reviews ignore to me one of the cornerstones of this record, which again are the strength of the lyrics, the extraordinary insight and depth of those lyrics, and the stories and the tight and tautness of those stories. And how identifiable this record is as a human being to listen to it. And it not that the lyrics aren't, Peter Gabriel's he's a stunning writer. And in my mind, his first 6 proper studio albums is one of the greatest runs in rock history. So, I'm contrarian while still admiring the hell out of everything that guy has done.
Yeah.
But it does frustrate me to read reviews where nobody mentions the poetry. Nobody mentioned. To me, he's Dylan. He's Springsteen. He's all these, and on and on and on. These great poets, and that's kind of frustrating. I don't know whether rock critics ever really were people who listened to the lyrics and built that into unless they were instructed to in PR packages and management or whatever, or it was like a Phil Collins Face Value, where it was pretty much known out of the gate this was about the disillusion of his marriage and the beginning of a new relationship. And this Gabriel's second album is up. You have to actually read those things to understand, read those songs, read those lyrics to understand the power of this album. In my mind, it not that the third album and the fourth album specifically, but thinking about it really is spoon feeding you Peter Gabriel. It's like big brass arrangements, and you got Kate Bush on there, and I don't even mean that as a negative, but it's a much more accessible record. I wouldn't necessarily compare it to Invisible Touch, which came out, I think, the same year, within months of each other. But I think Peter Gabriel, too, really does apply to the nerd, really does appeal to the nerd in you, to the same person who reads fiction. I read an article recently about how men don't read fiction anymore. They don't read novels anymore for whatever reason. They read sports autobiographies, or they read magazines. And that broke my heart, that we're losing a sense of the value of literature. And that second album is literature to me in a way that stands out from the rest of the records.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, there you go, folks. I mean, I hope this gives you a new appreciation for this record. You let us know in the comments below. I mean, give us your ranking of these Peter Gabriel albums. I thought this was great. I'm gonna go away and read all these lyrics again right now, actually, which is and listen to this record. But yeah, go listen to this record. I think Ralph's done an awesome job in terms of getting us back into this album, and again, I mean, the entire catalog. I love that idea about this being a great run. So thanks again, Ralph. Will you join us again for Pink Floyd? What do you think?
Yeah, of course. And one last thing, if anyone out there decides to listen to it, I want them to imagine Peter Gabriel before that third album. Just try to shed all your preconceived ideas of who he is and what he's done, which isn't easy, and try to just think of this guy as a 27-year-old. And the other thing I wanted to mention too, is this, what's remarkable about this record in its production, it was recorded in Holland, and it does not sound like a European record. I know some of it was done, I think, in Manhattan, some post-production was done on it. But I always thought when I listened to it, I thought, I can't believe this was done in Hilverbeek, or I'm not sure what the town is, something like that in Holland, because it sounds like an American record in the best possible sense. Yeah. With its rock, with its funk and its folk, and it's a beautiful piece of work.
Wicked.
Stunning.
All right.
10 out of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. So there you go. We'll have Ralph back for Pink Floyd. But for now, everybody, go listen to some Peter Gabriel too. We'll talk to you later.